Okay. So when those alerts goes off, they really freak me out. And sort of the bad news about this is that they actually go off far more often than I would like them to. The good news is that it's because our IT department recycles our VMs every now and again, and our monitors aren't good enough quite yet to withstand a reboot. So this is stuff that I use all day long, and so hopefully hopefully you're seeing things slightly better than I'm seeing, but I'm using this all day long. I'm actually the product manager for Tableau Bridge. We'll talk about that much longer. I sit with the development team. We make it go all day long, so that's good. I think that's all the introductions stuff we have here. Here are the basic topics that we're going to cover today. Really, some general ideas about connecting to online, how you get your data there, some general ideas just to think about it, because it actually turns out to be fairly complicated. And then actually being able to keep your data fresh. There's a couple different methods we'll use to talk about that. We'll talk about this specifically about cloud data and on-prem data, and that's my little feature at the end, Tableau Bridge. We'll also talk about a couple alternatives that we talked about earlier, and if we have time, we'll get into sort of fancier extracts. Feel free to ask questions if anything comes up. Really, the thing that I'm hoping that you'll walk away from this today is like, I have a viz, and I want it to always be up to date. The expiration date should say never. This is always going to be good. It will never be rotten milk. So if you have questions about that, or like didn't get everything you need before the end of the show, come find me afterwards, and we'll make sure you do. So first off, just a couple concepts about how we do things. If you are in Tableau Desktop today and you just publish a viz, what you're actually doing is you're making a snapshot. It's like a picture you get out of your shoebox somewhere. So here's an example of a viz that it's fixed in time, right? It's got 1900 to 2013. You can refresh this all you want. It's never going to get more up to date. And this is the way that many vizzes are published, but it's not the way things have to be. There's lots of different types of data that online can connect to. The blue ones there are all cloud-based data. The gray ones are on-prem data. You can publish it in a variety of different ways, and we'll go into these a little bit later, so don't worry if all these words on the screen don't make sense yet. Almost everything can be kept fresh automatically. There are a few exceptions, but not very many. And the key thing to think about is how you set up your publication really changes how you keep things fresh. So we'll dive into that pretty deeply. So I'm going to talk about three concepts here. I've got some icons here, and these are actually the icons on the left and right-hand side that you actually see inside Tableau Desktop. That very first thing I talked about, when you publish something and the data is just kind of part of the workbook, that's called an embedded data source. It lives inside the data source. It is private, meaning that once it's there, no one else can really go and use it for anything else. It's also, they're a little bit trickier to refresh, and so we don't talk about them a ton. The alternative is to publish a data source. This is the idea that when you're publishing, you're actually publishing two things. There's the workbook itself and the data source. And that data source is something that somebody else could come along and use. They could say, ooh, like this data source has all the fields I want. I'm going to get it, but I'm going to make a different viz out of it. A difference between these and embedded things, an embedded thing is a one-time snapshot. If you have a published data source, you may actually have to go and keep it up. Let's say the underlying schema changes, or I don't know, does anyone ever have their passwords changed on them? Anything like that. If those stop working, like, yeah, you're going to have to go and fix up your data source there a little bit. But generally speaking, they're much easier to keep up to date. Another distinction is really between where the data lives. And I mean this very, very broadly. And an easy way to think about it is it on a publicly accessible IP address? Is it on a cloud IP address or someplace that anybody could maybe browse up to? Or is it really on a private network? And what this turns out to be for most people is a cloud-based data source versus an on-prem or a CorpNet data source. There's a key difference about how we address these I'll get to in just a second here. And probably throughout this talk, I will say on-prem means you have a firewall. It's not true that cloud-based data sources don't have firewalls. It's just true that people are much more comfortable changing them. But we'll keep going on here. Good. And then the last thing is really the difference between live and extract. An extract is a snapshot of your data. You can imagine that if you made an embedded data source, that is actually an extract. The difference that we're going to talk about today is that if you make an extract, you might want to refresh it, and you do that periodically. The alternative is having a live data source where when I ask the question, I get the data that is in the database today. So that one's pretty obvious. Any questions so far? These slides will be published after the event, so yeah, got it. So if you guys see something on here and didn't get a chance to write it down, come talk to me or we'll get you the slides. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, awesome. Could you just keep doing that, please? Just raise your hand and say, that was my question. I would really appreciate that. So now we get into the metaphorical situation here. Getting fresh data is like getting a movie. So imagine that you wanted to watch a popular TV show such as, suggestion from the audience, The Office. You may actually decide to get that just via like DVDs from Netflix. And this is great. When you get the DVD, you've got everything you need to watch that video. You can watch that entire episode. When do you get the next one? I send the next one, I send the old one back, I get the next one back. They just come like that. They're fast, they're easy to load. It's pretty simple. An analogy for that is really, those are like extracts. A couple data sources that you would use for this, Google Analytics, Excel if you had data in an Excel sheet, and actually almost anything you can make an extract out of. Google Analytics and Excel are examples of ones that you cannot query otherwise. But I think The Office is actually streaming now, and streaming is a little bit more like a live query. You're like, hey, I want to watch The Office. And then what's the thing that you get after you say, I want to watch The Office? It has to go and buffer up the stream, and live query doesn't do that, but certainly the round trip to and from the server is going to take some time. So you may see a spinning thing for a few seconds, but the difference is that you don't have to wait for the mailman to come, right? You don't have to wait for the next scheduled event. How many people get DVDs to watch their TV shows these days? That's kind of what I thought. Okay. Yeah, okay. So a couple examples of these. Cloud-based data sources have to be in the cloud. So AWS Redshift is a prime one. There are many, many I'm sure that you're familiar with. Oracle's got plenty out there now. A couple words just about your data. We've been talking about data sources, but I wanted to make sure that we actually talked about the data itself. Remember, I said earlier, there are a couple different ways that you can help tell your users what data is actually there. This one is one that I think very few people know about, but is maybe about the best. You can actually include the date and time of the last update in your title or your caption. This is probably not the most important thing about your data. You like people to have insights about it, so maybe putting in your captions a little bit better. But it is really only limited to those two fields. Someday, when I find the person who did that, we're going to have a talk about that. But this is a great way of helping people understand what happened. I'll get to you in just a second. The others in the content management system of Tableau Server or Tableau Online, for any viz or any data source, there will always be a column that says either this is live or here's when the last extract or update was performed and here's when the next one's coming up. Did you have a question? It's a good question. The question was, can I embed this in a dashboard by making it the title of the sheet, but then making the sheet really tiny? You're very perceptive. Yeah, that's certainly one of the many, many tricks you can do to sort of get these into a better spot. The last way you can tell if your data is out of date is if your boss calls. So this is what we're trying to avoid today. That's a bad way. So I really recommend the top two methods there. Those are much better. One other question that comes up a lot is how do I get the latest data right now? If I say click the refresh button, you will all know exactly the wrong button to click. So click that one instead. It's important that you actually click the one in the viz itself as opposed to just a browser refresh button, because that will just re-render the whole page and get you stuff out of the cache. But that is the right way to go off and get things out of the database right away. We do pretty aggressive caching in Tableau Online, and so it's very, very possible that if you pull up a viz, you may see something that's a few minutes old. It would be really, really weird if you pulled up a viz and had something that was many, many days out of date. But again, a field like this will really help you understand, like, hey, when was the last time I got this for real? Hey, guess what? I put animations on this slide. So here's the thing I was talking about earlier. Here's how to tell inside Viz Portal or the content management system when it's been refreshed. And yeah, this one last section on the details page here. One other word about the data. A lot of times, oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's true. The question was, how long is the cache in online? I can't give you an exact figure. We may actually change it. Typically, it's about 15 minutes. Can I change that? No, because you change that for everything in online. So it's not a control that you have. It's something that we're considering and thinking about. All right. So another question that sometimes comes up is, hey, I want to make things faster. We'll talk about some fancy extracts and some other ways of getting things faster, but there's just some basic physics involved. And data gravity is really the term that's used for this now. The basic idea is that things are faster if they're closer together. So here are a couple ways that you could potentially move things closer together. Online, Tableau Online, our SaaS offering, is available in 3 geographies right now. The West Coast of the United States, we have a couple what we call pods, like instances. In the West Coast right now, one on the East Coast that is actually in AWS, and one in Europe, in Dublin. And so if you are on an online site or planning to move to one, it pays a little bit to think about which one's closest to where my data is. If you happen to be in the situation where your data is in a fixed location and there's no way you're ever gonna, we're just not gonna pick it up and move it around. Another alternative is actually to run, I think what you were doing earlier, what we like to call hosted server. So you can pick your own AWS data center, Google Compute Platform, any of those things, and really just deploy a server there. And if your data also happens to be in that, there are a couple advantages. Some egress-ingress fees. You're probably much, much faster in terms of just the data latency. Yeah, so that's mostly about, hey, what can I do at a very basic level to make things get a little bit faster? So next up, we're going to talk a little bit about cloud data. When you refresh your data, if you're working in desktop, especially if you're working with a cloud data source, there's a misconception that comes up sometimes. I'll put it up on the screen here in just a minute. But when you're accessing that cloud data source, what's actually happening is that Tableau Desktop is going off and talking to your cloud server. Works great. And then if I publish that, what I'm doing is I'm taking that data and that data connection, actually moving it up to online. Works great. Sometimes we'll find problems where people say, okay, now I want to refresh this. And the problem comes in that it's not these things. It's not Tableau Desktop that's refreshing that. You've already made some connection. Your IT department has given you access to your cloud data source. It's actually online that's refreshing that. And if that does not have access to actually get to the data, it won't work. Pro tip, if not all cloud data sources have this, but if your cloud data source has an active firewall, whitelisting online IPs is like the good thing to do beforehand. That is actually a link that I'm not going to click it right now. Oh, let's go ahead. Let's click it. It'll be fun. But this is just straight after one of our help articles. You can see here are some IP ranges right there. As our number of pods grow, this will get bigger. But come back and get the slides and take a look at this link there. That's probably the best thing to get the most current list. If you are using an IP address for a pod today, it's not going to change. So that list will get longer as we get more pods, but if you've done it once, you don't need to do it again. So I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the easiest thing to do is to make sort of the static snapshot. You make an extract, and it's embedded into your viz. You're never going to update that. How do I actually get it into an updatable state? And the answer is publish your extract. So the idea here really is what you're doing is you're grabbing a snapshot of the data, pushing it up to online. Pushing an extract to online will, remember that data gravity problem I talked about a minute ago? That erases the data gravity problem because the data is right there and online. It also means that the data is just as fresh as your last extract. So if you're extracting it every month, your data will be fresh every month, but super fast. So once you've actually made your extract, this is something you do locally, you actually just put it, just go to the data menu and publish. If you publish your workbook, let's see here. Yeah, if you actually just, here's how to actually make the extract. So that's actually creating an extract on your local computer. Do make sure to just pick these off the bottom. When you go to publish this, say, hey, I want to publish these data sources separately. That makes them a published data source, which is the type that you can refresh. That's the pro tip there. But then once you actually publish it to online, you'll get a schedule to say, hey, how often can I refresh this? I want to refresh it once a day, once an hour, and online itself will go off and get those extracts for you. So here's an example of the actual scheduling. This is a publish dialog that you see in the web portion of online after you publish. Just before we go through the animations here, the frequency with which you can refresh extracts down to 1 hour, depending on whether or not it's a cloud or on-prem data source. Extracts, just to be really clear, because online is actually doing all of those, you can imagine that there's a background or there's some server there that's going off and running through all of them. You may get at the beginning of the line or the end of the line, so the exact time may be a little bit different. It can change from day to day, but should not change dramatically. Time zones are all UTC, actually, sorry, Pacific time. There are now some self-service schedules, which means you get a little bit more flexibility in terms of setting prioritization, schedule and frequency, and our time zones behave better, especially for people, I think mostly in Australia. Anybody from Australia today? Okay, awesome. But you are not in online, so this problem does not, this time zone problem doesn't happen for you. Once you actually click, once you actually get through the publishing dialog, this is the server scheduling menu. These are actually, there's a fairly comprehensive list in here of being able to pick by hour for each day. Any other questions about cloud-based extracts? Yeah, go for it. The question was, if I have an ETL tool such as Alteryx and I want to publish the output of my job, can I script it? It's later in the slides, but the answer to your question is yes. And the way that you would script it is you'd use the Tableau command line extract utility. We'll talk more about that as it comes up. So also inside cloud data, you can make live connections. So this is a little bit more like streaming. You can see I have these little icons down here that hopefully remind you a little bit of all the analogies there. The advantages are, hey, the viz data should be very up to date. And the disadvantage is you may get that buffering sign, right? Because you're actually going and querying the database. This type of connection applies to cloud-based data sources. I think you probably all know what they are, so I'm not going to read the list. And if you really want to go and see the list, this is the right link. If you search in any of the Tableau help, you'll get to it very, very quickly. It used to be about 12 items. I think it's about 25 now. We'll do a demonstration on Snowflake in a minute. In order to make a live connection, one tip is, as you're actually in the data pane, don't make an extract. But when you go to publish, really go ahead and click edit my data sources. So as you're publishing, this is the publish workbook dialog. but you do need to go and make sure that you actually set it to be refreshable. Otherwise, you'll get it up there, but it will not refresh. So some nice little green boxes for you there. And then when you click OK, that's done. It's all taken care of. I think I saw a hand go up. All right. And just again, if you want to see what's the latest in there, always click that little refresh button. Yeah, speaking of Snowflake, so let me go ahead and just take a quick look here. So here is a Snowflake database, and I put this together. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah. I know why that is. Thank you for telling me. Nope. OK, we're going to do that. Haha. OK, here we are. So I was trying to figure out, hey, how can I, oops. Yeah. So this is actually Tableau Online. I'm going to have to sign in again here. Sorry, should have signed in before. I personally, I like beer that's a little bit more bitter. But I really dislike hangovers. And so I was trying to figure out, like, hey, which is the, sort of bittery beer that, that I could drink, and, here's how it's bitter, and here's the price you pay the next day. This is just a made-up viz. Really what I want to do is just go off and modify the data in Snowflake and show you how the viz changes. So this is actually connected to the Snowflake database that I was showing you just a second ago. And this is actually in Tableau Online. So let's just go ahead and go out here and take a look at my worksheets. Which is going to work any second now. Let's see here, small cheap. There we go. Oh, no, still not getting it. Oh, maybe if I click the right icon. Should have brought my bifocals. So just to give you a sense of what the data is, let's just go ahead and execute this. Here's the trick answer, right? Which is the best beer? It's the best bitter beer. Of course it is. So right now, the value for the low end of the IBUs for the best bitter beer is actually set to 60. And if we go back to the viz here, you can see that this is actually already set up to 60. Actually, that's cheating. I ran my queries in the wrong order here. So what I'm going to do is set it back to its original value, which is 25. So I'm actually going to modify the database at this point. Poof. And then we're going to go back up to online. And just like I said earlier, let's make this big. Oh, I'm actually in the middle of editing this, so I'm going to close this. So this is the viz itself. And what I want you to look for is where does the best bidder show up. So as I said, if you want to get the latest data, refresh it. There's our data gravity at play. You can see Belgian is now the winner, and best bidders moved down here. So this is just a quick example of what it would look like if you're using live queries. As you click that refresh button, it'll go and pick up whatever's happened most recently. Any questions about that? Nope? OK, awesome. Now we get to play with our good friend PowerPoint again. All right. The people who made this anticipated my needs here. So hey, we have finished up that extremely simple demo there. We're going to move on from cloud-based data sources. So if you have other questions about cloud-based data sources, now's a very good time. Otherwise, we're going to start talking about on-prem, and I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about them, because that guy's got a question.
Yeah, so one question about is every cloud connection support?
Yes. So the question is, does every cloud-based data source support extracts? I'm trying to think of if there's, the answer is yes. There are cloud-based data sources which are extract only. Salesforce is an example, Google Analytics is an example, but there are no cloud-based data sources which will not let you make an extract. Yeah, go ahead.
Question about Salesforce. I know that it's extract only.
Yep.
Is there any way to circumvent that as far as not having to mirror the data from Salesforce in something like S3 or Redshift?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, many people do this. The connection, sorry, let me ask the question again. The question was, hey, if I want to go get Salesforce data, do I actually have to go through the extract process to have a direct connection between online and Salesforce itself? Or could I actually mirror my data in some other cloud-based data source or even an on-prem data source? Absolutely, yes. Many, many, many people do this. In fact, it's one of the prime scenarios we have for Tableau Bridge, where we've gotten our Salesforce data, we've put it into a warehouse, and now we're joining it with a bunch of other data and getting it back up to online. Did you all think of your other questions? All right, well, let's talk about on-prem data. Ooh. Oh, I went to the wrong demo section. I'm sorry. I don't want to preview all the slides for you. There we go. Okay, that looks better. So the question here is, you remember the diagram I showed you earlier when if you get your data from a cloud-based data source, put it into your desktop, publish it to online, and when online needs to get that data again, it needs to go and get the data. But as it turns out, in almost every case when your data is on-prem, there's something standing between that data and online. And at the end of the day, there are very, very few companies or individuals who are actually going to open online to be able to make connections directly. It is technically feasible. We can talk about it. It's not really a great idea. So how do I get to my on-prem data and keep it fresh? One option is just to publish again and again. That sounds horrible. The other option is to use an on-prem agent. And our on-prem agent used to be called Tableau Online Sync Client. We've renamed it to Tableau Bridge. Really what it does, it exists to make outbound connections to online so that you can do extracts and live connections. Your firewall always stays intact. Just like all data that goes to online, it will always all be encrypted. Tableau Bridge used to work for extracts only. In 10.3, which is the release before the last one, we actually added live connections. So that's a brand new feature. I can talk a little bit about how those work. The supported data sources for it really, let's see, the question earlier was, is there any cloud data source that doesn't support extracts? Is that right? The answer is almost the same for Bridge. There are very, very few data sources that you cannot get data from using extracts. It really turns out to be cubes. And cubes is something that, in general, you cannot get on-premises data from. For live connections, it's a narrower list. It's really just relational databases. Any questions so far? No? Okay. The extracts, the way that extracts actually work, Tableau Bridge wakes up a couple times an hour, phone's online, and says, hey, when is the next scheduled event? I'll get to you right after this. And at the time that the next scheduled event happens, it it actually runs the extract locally and then pushes it up to online. So it's all in outbound connections. Live connections actually work. It's a little bit more like a chat client. We do make an outbound connection, but the outbound connection is a very long-lasting connection. We have to do that because when you issue a query, you don't want to wait for 15 minutes or half an hour for the next polling event to happen, right? It has to be live, so we need to keep that connection open. I have a few more metaphors down here. For live connections, it's a little bit more like dealing with a telephone, right? When you want to make a live connection to, I don't know, grandma, you actually string a piece of copper wire. It's this very long-lasting connection. It goes to your house. You can pick it up and call whenever you want. The alternative is really a little bit more like getting a postcard, the mailman. It's like, it's going to come, usually around 4 o'clock, not on Sundays. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as it goes on here. So to use an on-prem extract, oh, sorry, yeah, questions? Essentially, no. If you can string together something, there are ways to get around this. Somebody earlier was mentioning using an ETL job, take things out of BW, put into a columnar database. Sure. But SAP BW in general, I've never found a way to make that work directly with the tools that we have. You have to have an intermediate step. Yeah, go ahead.
Can Tableau Bridge scrape a file out of like an email, like out of Gmail? So if I have a file that's generated, it sends it to my email hourly, can Bridge scrape that file and then post it?
No. So I think the question was, could Tableau Bridge extract something from a cloud-based data source like Gmail? The answer is no. It's really designed for on-premises data. But the thing that you probably want to look into would be a web data connector. Depending on what you're doing, all that email that lives in the cloud, someday it comes to a hard drive. And if that, if the file that you're talking about actually ends up on your disk, then the answer is probably yes. The only trick is that Tableau Bridge, when connecting to files, really only deals with extracts. So it wouldn't be a live connection situation, but yeah, it should be able to deal with a file on a disk, even if it shows up and is refreshed on a regular basis. Yeah, go ahead. Can I refresh things more frequently than every 15 minutes? No. Not using Tableau Bridge. And honestly, we should talk a little bit more. If you're doing something that needs to be refreshed every 5 minutes, you maybe want a live query. Like, tell me about how timely your data needs to be and why 5 minutes is the problem. Your alternative would be to use one of the other, they're called alternatives in the slide deck, but the Tableau command line extract utility or the REST APIs. You could get closer to that, but let's talk after. Okay, good, moving on. So on-prem extracts, what kind of data is this? It's pretty much anything that lives behind your firewall except cubes. Sorry, SAP. Why should I extract this? You get a very predictable flow of data. It shows up every 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week, 1 month. It also gives much faster viz loading because of the data gravity problem we talked about earlier. The data is online. It's right there. Great, I've made an extract, but now I want to keep it fresh. I don't want to have that bad milk problem. Tableau Bridge is the right way to do this. Bridge is actually an on-prem client, and especially for extracts, for a reason that I'll explain in a minute. We try pretty hard to let Bridge run on the computer where the data is. This isn't the only way to do it, but it's a way that you may actually end up with Bridge running on your computer, even in cases where you really don't actually want it. But Bridge just runs on your local computer, and as I described a few minutes ago, gets schedules from online, wakes up on those schedules, creates a local extract, and pushes it to online. So how do we actually do this? When you publish your workbook, there's this little section called Datasources down here. Right underneath that, there's a little edit button. This is the important section right here. You want to publish the data separately. When you're publishing a workbook, this means I'm publishing a workbook and a data source. If you're just publishing a data source, you don't actually have to do this bit. But do make sure that you set it up to refresh, make it accessible for refresh. After you actually finish the publication process to online, you'll get a little hooray notice here. And it goes a little bit farther. It actually says, now that you've published to online, do you actually want to set up a schedule for this? And this is the scheduling UI for Tableau Bridge. This actually lets you get down to 15 minutes. that nice man leave? Okay. And actually, once you pick the schedule, that should be it. We try really, really hard to make it so that you don't actually have to launch things or go and configure and sign in. You will eventually actually have to sign into Bridge because otherwise we can't publish to online. But as a user, hopefully we make the flow fairly simple there. Yeah, question? Great questions. So the question is, if I'm using Tableau Bridge to run an extract, does my computer need to be on for the extract to work? Everybody already knows the answer to that question. Yes, the truth is yes, on. So you asked much better questions, the other two parts. Do I have to be signed in, and do I have to be logged into my computer? Yeah. I think your question is, do I need to be signed into online? Like, do I have to have a web browser open? Yep. Yeah. We'll talk through the whole scenario in just a second. You don't have to be signed into Tableau Online in the web browser, but Tableau Bridge needs to be signed in. So we do have to have some authentication, right? Because we're not just going to upload anything to any site. We're going to go to the site that you're signed into. So Tableau Bridge is designed to work many days in a row. Once you sign in, it will be very persistent. So you don't need to worry about signing in again. But the next question is an interesting one. What happens if I turn on Bridge and want to go to sleep? Because the IT fairy comes around and logs me out of my computer at midnight every night. Tableau Bridge has two modes that it runs in, something called application mode or service mode. We actually changed the terminology recently to be the things that I just said. We used to describe it more clearly, but it's such a mouthful that it seems like kind of a goofy thing to say. It's either run continuously or run only when logged in. So if you're using Tableau Bridge 10.2 or earlier, those are the things you'll see. You want to run in service mode in order to have to keep the IT fairy away. Are there any IT fairies in the room right now? Because we love you. Tableau Bridge is actually designed, we're hoping that it just makes your life easier, not harder, especially because you don't have to come by and explain why it doesn't work anymore. Hang on one second, I think there was one other person with their hand up, but maybe not, so go for it. I would like you to think of online as your Tableau server. The answer is no. And the question was, does Bridge connect to any Tableau server? No, it only connects to online. But I'd love to talk with you more later because I'd like to understand exactly why you're asking for that. This is something we've thought about quite a bit, and the question comes up fairly often, but it's tricky to understand how that's going to help you. So please come find me. We'll talk more. I'm very, very interested. Here's our mailman down here, just to remind you. When you set this up, this is the kind of thing that's going to come on a schedule, just like a postcard, just like anything else that comes in the mail. A couple best practices here. As I mentioned a minute ago, especially for extracts, there are cases in which the type of data you're attempting to extract is only available on one computer. This type of data is called a file. It's not true for all files. Some files live on networks and other great things like that. But if you do a very normal thing, which is, hey, I just want to sync this Excel spreadsheet up to online, you actually have to run Bridge on that computer because otherwise the file's not accessible. That is what we consider to be a self-service model. We're very, very happy to let you do that. And in fact, that is the easiest way to do it. We'll just make that happen for you. But in looking at how customers are using Bridge in the real world, we find that almost nobody does it this way. There's more of what we'd like to call the central model, where one very nice person sets up one bridge, and that bridge is used for refreshing all extracts. And the nice thing about that is you don't have to worry about somebody bumping out the power cord or other things along those lines. So set up a really durable computer. It's a good way to go. If you have a ton of extracts, this is a problem we run into customers who are trying to move a lot of very large extracts during a log shipping window. Hey, I've only got 4 hours in which I can actually do all my extracts. And my extracts are huge, and it takes me an hour just to publish one of them, but even longer to create it. You can actually parallelize, it's a very tricky word to say, right? Extracts by actually running more than one bridge client and setting up schedules individually. So for extracts, that's a little tip that works well for some folks. I mentioned earlier that the very worst way to find out if your data is out of date is from a customer, like a user saying, why isn't this up to date? And so we do now send emails. If for some reason the extract failed to run, we'll send you a couple emails. We try to not spam very much. I can tell you a bunch of details about that, but we probably got to keep moving. When you publish, embed your credentials. Because, oh, actually, on the Bridge client itself, for extracts, we do not transmit the credentials. And so if you are publishing publishing a data source that actually requires username credentials, has a specific credential such as test and password, which would never happen, then you actually have to go and set that up in Bridge. We try hard to let you know that some action needs to happen with this lovely little triangle down here. And if you wanted to do something with it, use the pencil thing. So if you ever see that little triangle there, yeah, it very well could be, hey, somebody published something but didn't include their username and password. Yeah, I think that's about it for extracts. Next, we're going to talk about on-prem connections. So this is pretty new. It's been out a little bit more than about 4 months now. Partly because we looked at how people were using our extracts, we've changed the model for how we do live connections. Just to set us up correctly, essentially, Bridge is doing something very similar to what it does with extracts. It sits in an on-premises computer. Instead of waiting for a scheduled event, it sets up a long-lasting connection to online. It's an outbound connection, but it stays open for a very, very long time. It doesn't actually stay open for that long. We actually cycle connections, and we can talk all about technical goo, but we'll get there later. Big changes in the way that it works for live connections are that we really said, you know what, most people want to use this centrally, and the person who we can land work on their computer, like without having to ask permission, sort of what responsible person in an organization would you do this to? Sorry, site administrators, it's you. So the site administrator has a much bigger role in setting these up. Was that a question? No. Essentially, to run live connections, the site administrator needs to actually go and turn it on. This is available for any site administrator to do in online today. They will also need to run the Bridge client on a computer that both they or a local administrator can sign in on, because it needs to run as a service. That site administrator will also need to sign into the Bridge client there. So this little chain of identity and service there. I will show you here, this little green button here, that's telling us that we've made the appropriate type of connection for things to work in online. So green means go. Once you start to see this green thing, things should start working. The good news is that for publishers, this is extremely simple. When you're publishing extracts, there are actually a few extra steps you need to do to say, oh, it needs to go on this Bridge client. I need to set this schedule. None of those things matter for Bridge, for live connections. And so we'll actually run through the publication flow real quickly here. And just in terms of metaphor, this is a little bit more like stringing the telephone line. Once you set it up once, you can make a call anytime you want. So we have our little telephone operator down there. So this is a high-level overview of the steps that you would need to take to set up live connections on Bridge. Imagine you were the site administrator. If you go into the settings section of your online page, I'm actually can I rewind that? Go back one, yeah. Hey, it's not going to work till you turn it on. It's off by default. This isn't something that we're just going to enable for everybody. So turn it on. You actually have to go and sign into your sync client, get things moving. That's already happened in this picture down here. You can see that this Bridge client is actually running in service mode. There's the little service mode indicator. That's actually made the appropriate connection type, but there's no data sources in it yet. So after you've set up that connection, next step is publish a workbook or publish a data source. Again, when you publish by default, it will just automatically go to embedded. That's not really what you want. You really want this thing. So make sure to touch that little edit link. When you start to talk about managing your data sources, if you're publishing a workbook, you would need to publish it separately, and you get a choice here. I'm publishing it separately, so I can either make an extract, which is what we talked about on the previous slides, or maintain a live connection, which is, of course, what we're going to do on this slide. The authentication, if you choose prompt user here, this will actually prompt the user. So think about that. You may actually want to embed the credentials. And if you embed the credentials, it will just send them automatically and always continue to work. If you prompt, that means that the first time somebody opens this viz, they will need to use their credentials to actually get into the data, which is definitely desirable in some cases. And once you do that, you can see that the data source will actually show up in the Bridge client itself. Now, most of these users who are using this are never going to see the Bridge client. They don't. This is really just as a informational for our administrators. But yeah, it's good to let you know what's going on there. One other note about this, especially if you are the administrator, if you were to set up a live connection to your database, you might want to know who's using it. So we have an admin view that's specific to Bridge live connection. So you can go back through and say, hey, who's been using it over time? What's been going on with it? I don't cover it too much in this slide. A couple other notes. We've covered this. And this is a question that comes up very often, so pardon me for belaboring it. Bridge connections, live connections, in fact, all Bridge connections are secure. And the reason is something that I've said several times during the talk. All the connections that we make to online are originated from the on-prem network. So this is an easy way to think about this is your firewall is there to stop bad traffic from coming onto your network from outside the internet. But all of you go and browse the web every day, so how does that data get in? Anytime you start up a web browser, or in fact, almost anything that touches the internet, you create an outbound connection out of your network. As long as you start that outbound connection, the firewall says, I don't know, this smells like home, and lets you back through. So that's essentially what Bridge is doing. And that's the reason, and that is exactly, the alternative to doing this is actually opening ports on your firewall. Nobody wants to do that. So this is the reason Bridge exists. All of our connections are encrypted, TLS 1.2, we can talk more about the details of that. The data will only ever be in your site. We take quite a few steps to authenticate that as the data is flowing, it's going to the right place. It's being sent by the right user, it's going to the right site. If you really, really want to lock down Bridge clients, and we do have customers who do this, you can actually restrict the access that that particular machine has to the online IP addresses. Those are the ones that I showed earlier. You can actually just restrict it to that block. If you wanted to lock it down further, turn off all the other ports. We just need 443. That's what TLS and HTTPS travel over. There is one tricky thing. When you sign in, we actually need access to a bunch of assets, things like sign-in buttons. In order to do that, there's a couple tricky steps you need to take with the CDN. That's a content distribution network. I'll be happy to talk to anybody who wants to do that about how to do that. We don't get a ton of requests for it, but it does happen from time to time. And here's just a very simple diagram that sort of shows how things are working. If you can imagine one of your users is attempting to look at a viz that's using a live connection, they're sending, actually, the viz itself is sending a query to data server. Data server is actually passing it along to a service that we run in online. It's a remote query service. There's a couple components to it. And it's actually sending the query down to Bridge. And really, you can imagine that this arrow would just go boop right down here to an on-premises data server. That's what Bridge is doing. It's really taking your query and running it on a local data server. And then the data server itself, and protocols and some SQL dialects and a lot of other goo that we can talk about actually makes the query and then make the round trip. Questions about that? Okay. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're pretty close. How many people here work at very large enterprises? Oh, all of you. Okay, excellent. So if any of you who heard what I just said, hey, you can set up a Bridge client. The key thing there is a Bridge client. And if you have thousands of users who are going to go hit a subscription at 9 in the morning, you're going to need a pretty big client in order to serve those. Yes, we understand that's a consideration. And so here are some things that we've been doing recently and things that are coming up. In 10.4, the release that just came out about a few days ago, the client itself is actually uses a pool of threads to run its queries. This gives us a modest performance improvement. But really, the thing that you need to worry about is the janitor scenario where somebody bumps the power cord out of the only machine that's running Bridge, right? And that's, as you said earlier, it's not going to work if the power isn't on. Next year, there's an errant thread on my slide. I'm very embarrassed. As we set up, as we set up our future release coming up next year, we will actually allow you to have a collection of clients that act together in a pool. If one of these were to somehow stop working, the rest would continue working. We do a little bit of magic to figure out which one's fast, which ones are slow, where to route things. Really, that helps us with scalability and availability. So, coming up. A quick demo. We are about 5 minutes away from this session being over. So I wanted to offer you guys some choices. We can see a short little demo of how this actually works, or actually see it in action. The other things we can talk about are a little bit more about some alternatives to Tableau command line extract utility, the REST APIs, and faster extracts. Who wants to see a demo? Who wants to see more about extracts and other things? Oh, it's 50-50. I'm going to talk really fast. Okay, so... So here is actually, this is a VM. So this computer is actually a real VM running on Tableau's corporate network. This is a quick little viz that I made. I'm not going to show you the details, but I hope that you will trust me when I say it is actually accessing an on-prem SQL server. Very straightforward viz here. The only thing I'm really going to do is just go ahead and publish this workbook. I'm actually going to publish to online, and what I want you to watch is the Bridge client down in the corner here. We try to make it unobtrusive, so the dialog box is not going to stay up here. But if you watch the little Tableau icon down in the corner here, you'll see a little green querying indicator show up. So let me go ahead and publish this. And that's normal. Why did it do that? I think it kicks me off if I change the... Nope. Okay. Let's try again. I am actually going to go over here and... Oops. Does anybody have any good knock-knock jokes? Oh, that was very good. I like that one. Thank you. Did I get this right? Sign into my site here. There we are. And I want to actually delete the existing data source. Okay. Looks like I set this up properly, so let's try again here. My demo's not going to work today. But in a minute, you'll see some little green lights down here, or maybe when you try this at home. So forgive me after we, anybody who'd like to see it, we can certainly do it after the session. So it will work very, very soon. But let's go on with the slides before we run out of time. So just a couple words about on-prem alternatives. I've talked a lot about Tableau Bridge. It is, in fact, my feature. I actually don't work on these other features, and so I like to talk about them a little bit less. But my friend Ben up there likes to talk about them a lot. So if you see him here, you should accost him. There are a couple. There's the Tableau Data Extract Command Line Utility. I was not responsible for that name. The it does exactly what it says, which is a nice thing about names. It's just a small scriptable utility that takes an extract, makes an extract, and then pushes that extract online. Nice things about this are that it's very, very easy to plug into an ETL script. It's very easy to use on its own. It's not super complicated. Works with Tableau Online. My Australian friends, it also works with Tableau cloud-based servers or any other just local Tableau server. So it's a nice, easy way to make that happen. There's some exciting things to do down here. You can actually make this refresh using a service. This article will help you do that in a way that's pretty similar to Tableau Bridge. Also, there's the SDK. SDK, there's a variety of different languages that we support. This will actually let you create an extract from your data source. You actually build the extract itself and then publish that up to online. So we have a lot of people using Python with this. If you've got your own data source, these are fine things to do. But yeah, Ben looks just like that. Web data connectors are another alternative. Tableau, the command line extract, and the SDK really work with data sources that Tableau knows pretty well about, has drivers for. But imagine that you had like a web client that got a regular update, just got refreshed data every so often. How would you get that into online? So web data connectors it's an open source framework that you can actually go and write your own. There's a community around it, so many, many have already been written. The nice thing about using these in conjunction with Tableau Bridge is as long as you're not doing fancy authentication, you can actually go and get that web data and push it up to online using a scheduled event in Bridge. So this is just another quick way to do it. And there are a couple talks that I actually have listed at the end. There are a couple, I think the talks I have listed in this end do not concern WDCs so much, but look for web data connectors and let me know if you have other questions about them. I'm not an expert, but I can find the guys who are. And then a couple words about optimizing extracts. A problem with extracts is that they can be big, so make them smaller. It's hard to make them very, very small, especially if you actually use all that data, but it's worth thinking hard about how much of the data you use. And imagine you just had a big field that had a bunch of stuff in it. If you start to hide those things, they'll actually be excluded from the extract. That'll make things faster. Pre-aggregation is another way of doing this. Instead of capturing all the data, run a quick query that summarizes what's in your underlying data, make a smaller extract. There's an admin view in online that will tell you a little bit about the duration that extracts run now. This is a problem that we find, especially with people who have sort of these tight timelines where like we got to do all our extracts in this very narrow window. Great, how long are they actually taking? So that will help out there. Incremental extracts, very few people actually do this. It's about 3% of extracts total. But slightly more than 3%. This is a great way of, if you have a narrow log shipping window during the week, but an extended period of the weekend, in the weekend you can run one very big extract and then just do the stuff that changed on weekdays. I'm not going to read the rest of the words on the slide here. Let me know if you have questions about how to do that. Integrated data, this is the idea of, hey, I want to use some on-prem data and maybe some cloud data, but I want to join it together and create a new set of data out of that. This is supported by Bridge. You do get into some tricky scenarios here, but in general, yes, you can do that. You can actually avoid having to do that round trip by doing something called including external files. This is another thing I cannot take responsibility for naming. This slide says all the stuff that we talked about earlier today, but I have to let you go to your next talk, so I'm not going to read it. And if this was so fascinating that you want to come again, we can do that. But more importantly, here's some things that you might want to see as well. Optimizing and enhancing data queries. This would be a very interesting talk if any of the things we've talked about earlier today will come up for you. And then also fantastic data and where to find them. This actually does talk quite a bit about web data connectors. They will teach you how to write your own. So those are all interesting things. Thank you so much for your time. If anybody else has other questions, please let me know now. I'm happy to stay around. I think in the app you can actually look me up. And so if you want to reach out and contact me, let me know. Or come to the next session. And thank you all so much for your time.